554. The southern coast of Italy. A place called Squillace, on the narrow toe of the peninsula where the Ionian Sea catches the last of the afternoon light and holds it just long enough to make the cliffs look like bronze. A man named Cassiodorus Senator, and that is his full name. The word senator attached to him like a title he had earned before most titles meant anything anymore, was kneeling on the stone floor of a room he had built himself, in a monastery he had founded himself, on the grounds of the estate where he had been born perhaps 70 years before. He was not praying. He was reading. In his hands was a codex, not a scroll, but a bound book, which was still a relatively new technology in that part of the world. And the pages under his fingers contained the medical writings of Galen of Pergamon, a Greek physician who had died more than 350 years earlier, and whose work had, in the chaos of the preceding decades, nearly vanished from the Italian peninsula entirely. Cassiodorus turned the page. The lamp on the table beside him threw a circle of orange light across the vellum. Outside, somewhere below the hillside, the sea was moving. He had seen a great deal in his life. He had served as a young secretary to Theodoric the Great, the Ostrogothic king who had ruled most of Italy for more than 3 decades and who had, in his own complicated and frequently surprising way, tried to preserve as much of Roman administrative culture as a man of Germanic origin governing a fractured empire could reasonably manage. Cassiodorus had drafted letters in Latin that rivaled anything produced in the classical period. He had organized grain distribution, managed tax records, corresponded with the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople, and always tried, to hold the administration of Peninsula together with the sheer force of careful prose. And then the wars had come. The Eastern Roman Empire, which had never really stopped calling itself the Roman Empire, which had never really accepted that the West was gone for good, sent its armies under the general Belisarius, and then under Narses, to retake Italy. The war lasted 20 years. 20 years of armies moving up and down the peninsula, of cities besieged, of harvests burned, of the population of Rome itself dropping from perhaps 500,000 at its height to something closer to 30,000 in the worst years of the 6th century. When it was over, Cassiodorus was an old man. The Ostrogoths were gone. Italy was technically Roman again, in the Byzantine sense, though what that meant on the ground was not entirely clear. And so he came home. He came home to Squillace, and he built his monastery, and he named it Vivarium, which means in Latin, a place where living things are kept, a place where things are preserved, a place where something continues. He had very specific ideas about what monks should do. In most monastic communities of the period, physical labor was a primary vocation. Farming, building, maintaining the grounds. Cassiodorus did not disagree with this in principle, but he had another idea, one that would quietly shape the intellectual life of Western Europe for centuries after his death. He believed that copying manuscripts was a form of prayer. He believed that every stroke of the pen that reproduced a text, whether it was a biblical commentary or a treatise on mathematics or the medical writings of a long-dead Greek physician, was an act of spiritual labor equivalent to any physical work. He wrote, in a text called the Institutiones Divinarum et Secularium Literarum, the Institutes of Divine and Secular Learning, that the monk who could not preach with his voice could nonetheless preach with his hand, and that every word copied was a wound dealt to the devil. This is not a metaphor for dramatic purposes. He actually wrote that. The oldest surviving manuscripts of the institutions, held today in collections including the Cathedral Library at Bamberg and the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris, preserve that exact passage in a hand that dates to within a century or two of Cassiodorus himself. In the room where he knelt that evening in 554, there were men at work, younger men, monks in training, seated at inclined writing desks, the same ergonomic design, more or less, that scribes had used for centuries, copying out text by hand onto prepared animal skin. The room was designed with care. Cassiodorus had given thought to the lighting, to the positioning of the windows, to the quality of the inks. He had written instructions for the correct preparation of vellum. He had assembled a library of perhaps 200 volumes, which in the 6th century represented an extraordinary concentration of written knowledge. He was not saving civilization. He was not performing a dramatic rescue. He was doing the thing that came next. And that, in a way, is the entire story this evening. If you imagine the so-called Dark Ages, and most of us do, because we were taught to You probably picture something like this: a long, flat darkness, stretching from the fall of Rome to the Renaissance, roughly 1,000 years of ignorance and mud and superstition, with the occasional battle, and then, suddenly, light. Artists, scientists, the rediscovery of classical texts, the birth of the modern world. It is a compelling image. It is also, in almost every significant detail, wrong. Not wrong in the sense that nothing bad happened. Terrible things happened. Populations crashed. Cities shrank. Trade networks collapsed and reformed and collapsed again. There was real suffering. There was real loss. But the image of a long, continuous darkness, of a civilization that simply stopped, that is a story. A constructed story, built by people who had reasons to tell it, at specific moments in history, for specific purposes. And when you begin to look at what was actually happening in those centuries, what was being built, copied, translated, cultivated, imagined, and preserved, the darkness resolves slowly into something far more complicated and far more alive. That is what this evening is about. Not a simple reversal. Not a claim that everything was fine and the historians lied. The hardship was real. The fragmentation was real. Some of what was lost was genuinely, permanently lost. But the shape of those centuries, the actual texture of life and thought and technology across the post-Roman world, is a shape that has been systematically misrepresented, first by the people who named the period, and then by the educational traditions that inherited that naming without always stopping to examine it. Cassiodorus, kneeling on a stone floor with his lamp and his Galen, was not an isolated eccentric, preserving scraps from a burning world. He was part of a network, an enormous, living, fractured, argumentative, creative, occasionally violent, always moving network of people and institutions and ideas that stretched from Ireland to Persia, from the monasteries of the Scottish Highlands to the libraries of Alexandria and Baghdad, from the fields of the English Midlands to the counting houses of Byzantine Constantinople. That network is the real story. And tonight, with your eyes closed, with the weight of the day already beginning to settle, we are going to move through it together. Slowly. There is no hurry. The manuscripts are still there. Here's the question that this story is actually asking. Not, were the Dark Ages really dark? That question is too simple. It invites a simple answer, and simple answers about complex centuries are almost always wrong in at least one important direction. The real question is older and stranger than that. It goes something like this. When a civilization tells a story about the past, when it chooses a name for an era, when it draws a line and says everything before this line was lesser, was darker, was somehow not yet fully human in its intellectual ambitions, what is that civilization actually doing? What need does that story serve? And what does it hide, not through deliberate deception, but through a far more ordinary mechanism of simply not looking at the things that do not fit the story you have already decided to tell? That is the deeper question. Because the term Dark Ages was not coined by people who had studied the medieval period carefully and concluded, after weighing the evidence, that it was uniformly bleak. It was coined and then refined and then popularized by people who were in the middle of constructing an identity for themselves. An identity that required before and an after, a fall and a rise, a darkness and a light. And the people they positioned as a light were, conveniently, themselves. The Italian poet Francesco Petrarch, writing in the 14th century, is often credited with being among the first to use something like the Dark Ages concept in an explicit form. He wrote of a period of tenebrae, of shadows, stretching back from his own time to the fall of Rome, and he contrasted it with the lux, the light of antiquity. He was a man who loved classical Latin with an almost painful intensity, who spent decades searching for lost Roman manuscripts, who felt himself personally injured by the gap between the civilization he admired and the civilization he inhabited. His framing was poetic, personal, and deeply motivated by his own aesthetic passions. It was not, in any rigorous historical sense, a description, but it stuck, and over the following centuries, the humanists of the Renaissance, and then the philosophers of the Enlightenment, and then the educational systems of the 19th century that carried their assumptions forward into classrooms and textbooks and popular culture, elaborated that initial image into something that felt like fact. 1,000 years of darkness, a gap in the record, a civilization holding its breath, The trouble is that the people who were actually living in those centuries were not holding their breath. They were arguing. They were building. They were farming in new ways that increased yields across wide stretches of northern Europe. They were translating. They were innovating in metallurgy and hydraulics and textile production. They were creating legal frameworks that would form the foundations of later European jurisprudence. They were writing theology of considerable sophistication. They were, in the Islamic world that stretched from Spain to Central Asia, doing mathematics and medicine and astronomy at a level that Europe would not independently reach for several more centuries. None of this was darkness. It was transformation. And transformation is harder to narrate than collapse, because transformation does not have a dramatic moment. It does not have a date. It does not have a single image you can hold in your mind. It is a slow change of things over decades and centuries, the accumulation of small adjustments and adaptations and inventions that, looked at from a sufficient distance, add up to something that the people living through it could not have named and might not have recognized. That is what the evidence shows when you look at it carefully. And looking at it carefully is what the rest of this evening is for. But there's something I want to say before we go further. Something about what this kind of history actually asks of you as a listener. Most history is taught as a series of events. Things that happened, causes and effects, arranged in a line, with a larger meaning delivered at the end like conclusion to an argument. That kind of history is satisfying in a particular way. It feels like understanding. But the history of the post-Roman world, the history of those 5 or 6 centuries that the old label compressed into darkness, does not yield easily to that kind of telling. It is too uneven, too regional, too full of simultaneous contradictions that resist a single through line. In one decade, in the 7th century, you can find a monastery in Ireland producing illuminated manuscripts of astonishing beauty and technical refinement, while 200 miles away a settlement is being abandoned and its population scattering into the countryside. You can find, in the same century, the Islamic Caliphate establishing a bureaucratic and intellectual infrastructure that will become one of the most sophisticated in human history, while the Visigothic kingdom in Iberia is struggling with a succession crisis that will eventually make it vulnerable to conquest. These things are all happening at once. They are all real, and none of them cancels the others out. What the post-Roman world was, at its deepest level, was plural, not dark, not light, plural. Many different things in many different places, moving at many different speeds, in many different directions, connected by threads of trade and religion and kinship and manuscript and memory that were thinner in some places and others, but that never, in any region where we have evidence to look, disappeared entirely. The question this story is asking is not whether it was dark. The question is what it actually was. And that is a question that has been taking scholars most of the 20th and 21st centuries to begin answering with any real precision. The tools are better now. The archaeology is richer. The manuscript catalogs are more complete. The computational analysis of medieval texts and pollen records and soil samples and coin distributions has opened windows into a period that previous generations of historians simply did not have. What those windows reveal is not a civilization in suspended darkness. It is a civilization in motion, a civilization that lost some things and found others, that forgot some techniques and invented new ones, that contracted in some places and expanded dramatically in others, that grieved its losses in ways we can still read and built its futures in ways we can still see if we know where to look. And tonight, lying wherever you are, with the day receding and the dark settling around you in its comfortable way, we are going to look, not to reach a conclusion, not to win an argument with Petrarch's ghost, but because the shape of those centuries, once you begin to see it clearly, is genuinely one of the most interesting shapes in human history. And because understanding how the story of the Dark Ages was constructed tells us something important, something that applies well beyond the medieval period, about how all of us, in all eras, use the past to make sense of who we think we are. There is a particular kind of history that I find most valuable. Not the history of battles and dynasties, though those have their place. Not the history of great men making decisive gestures, though some of those gestures were real and consequential. The history I find most valuable is the history of quiet persistence, of the thing that continues when it has every reason not to. of the manuscript that survives because one particular person, in one particular room, decided that copying it was worth the time. Cassiodorus, kneeling in Squillace. That is where we began. And that image of a man in a lamplit room, doing the next thing, not performing salvation, but simply continuing, is the image that will carry us through everything that follows. Because the so-called Dark Ages were full of people like that, full of people doing the next thing. And the next thing, it turns out, was more extraordinary than almost anyone is given it credit for. Before we go any further, I want to say something directly to you, not to the history, not to the argument, to you, specifically, wherever you are right now. Whatever position your body is found, whatever weight is settling into the mattress or the pillow or the chair, whatever thoughts are still moving at the edges of your mind, doing the ordinary work of winding down, you do not need to remember any of this. Not the name Cassiodorus, not the monastery at Squillace, not the dates or the manuscript titles, or the names of the scholars we're going to meet in the hours ahead. None of it needs to be held. None of it needs to be cataloged or retained or carried forward into tomorrow. This is not a lecture. There will be no test. The only thing that is being asked of you tonight is that you stay as long as you want to and leave whenever your body decides it is time. If you fall asleep in the next 5 minutes, that is not a failure. That is, in many ways, the whole point. Let your eyes close whenever they want to. Let the words become something softer than meaning. If that is what happens, let them become texture or rhythm, or the low hum of voice in the dark that is simply present, simply moving, simply there. This story has been waiting 1,500 years. It can wait a little longer for you. And if you wake in the night or in the morning and find that some fragment of it has stayed with you, a name, an image, the idea of a monk in a lamplit room, that is enough. That is more than enough. The story does not require your full attention to do its work. History, real history, the kind that is settled into the bones of the civilization you were born into, has a way of transmitting itself below the level of conscious understanding, through atmosphere, through the slow accumulation of images, through the feeling, more than the fact, of a time and a place becoming briefly real. That is what we are doing tonight. Nothing more demanding than that. So let the breath slow if it wants to. Let the muscles that have been working all day begin the long process of releasing what they have been holding. Let the particular quality of this darkness, the darkness of a room you know, of a night that is already half familiar, let it come in around the edges of whatever light is still on and settle. The story is here. It is not going anywhere. And it begins as all good stories about the past begin, not with a theory, but with an object, something you could hold in your hands, something that is still, in some form, somewhere in the world, waiting to be looked at by anyone who cares to look. We are going to look, slowly, together. Let's begin with an object. It is the summer of 2009. A man named Terry Herbert is walking a recently plowed field near the village of Hammerwich, in Staffordshire, in the English Midlands. He is carrying a metal detector, which he has been using to search fields in this part of the country for about 18 years with modest and occasional results. On the 5th of July, his detector gives a signal. He digs. He finds a fragment of gold. He keeps digging. Over the following 5 days, Terry Herbert unearths more than 200 individual pieces of gold and silver metalwork from the soil of that field. He fills buckets. He fills bags. He runs out of containers. He calls the local archaeological authorities. The excavation that follows, conducted by the Birmingham Archaeology Unit and the Staffordshire County Council, eventually recovers a total of over 3,500 individual items, making it the largest hoard of Anglo-Saxon gold and silver metalwork ever found. The Staffordshire Hoard, as it is now known, is housed primarily at the Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery and the Potteries Museum in Stoke-on-Trent. Scholars date the objects of the late 6th or early 7th century. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. The gold filigree work, the intricate twisted wire designs soldered onto the surfaces of helmet fittings and sword pommels and decorative mounts, represents a level of technical skill that, when metallurgists examined it under electron microscopes, they found almost incomprehensible in its precision. These are not the objects of civilization in collapse. These are the objects of civilization with skilled craftspeople, established trade networks capable of supplying raw gold in significant quantities, patrons wealthy enough to commission work of this refinement, and an aesthetic tradition sophisticated enough to produce it. The question the Staffordshire Hoard forces is not whether the people of 7th century England were capable of beauty and technical mastery. The objects answer that question before it can be fully formed. The question is why, for so long, the default assumption ran in the opposite direction. We will come to that question. But first, more objects. In the summer of 1939, 70 years before Terry Herbert's metal detector found the first fragment in that Staffordshire field, a man named Basil Brown was working in the county of Suffolk on the eastern coast of England at a place called Sutton Hoo. Basil Brown was an archaeologist in the most practical sense of the word. He had left school at 14, educated himself through libraries and correspondence courses, and developed a fieldwork instinct that professional archaeologists of far more formal training would later acknowledge as exceptional. He was employed by Edith Pretty, the owner of the Sutton Hoo estate, to investigate a series of earthen mounds on her property that local tradition had long associated with ancient burial. On the 14th of May, 1939, Brown broke through the end of Mound 1 and discovered the iron rivets of a ship. The ship was 27 meters long. It had been dragged from a nearby River Deben, placed in a trench cut into the sandy soil of the hillside, and used as a burial chamber for a figure of considerable status. Most scholars now believe it was the East Anglian king Raedwald, who died sometime around 624. The burial goods placed in the central chamber of that ship included a ceremonial helmet of iron and bronze, a sword with a pommel inlaid with garnets cut with precision that still impresses modern gemologists, a set of hanging bowls of Celtic manufacture suggesting trade or diplomatic contact with Western Britain, a large silver dish bearing control stamp of the Byzantine Emperor Anastasius I, who ruled in Constantinople and died in 518, meaning the dish had traveled from the eastern Mediterranean to the coast of Suffolk sometime in the preceding century, and 37 gold coins from Frankish mints in what is now northern France. 37 coins from 37 different mints. The numismatic scholar John Hines, writing in the Cambridge Archaeological Journal, has argued that the selection of coins appears deliberate, that whoever assembled the burial collection may have been attempting to represent the breadth of the Frankish monetary system. Whether or not that interpretation holds under further scrutiny, the coins themselves are unambiguous evidence of contact, of trade, of a network that, in the early 7th century, connected the royal court of a small East Anglian kingdom to the monetary systems of the Frankish continent and to the silverware workshops of the Byzantine world. This is not isolation. This is not the sealed-off, locally contracted world of the darkness myth. This is a network, thinner and more fragile than a Roman network it replaced, certainly, but a network nonetheless, alive, operating, moving goods and ideas and people across considerable distances. The historian Michael McCormick, Gold Professor of Medieval History at Harvard University, spent more than a decade building what he calls, in the title of his 2001 book, The Origins of the European Economy. The book is, among other things, a systematic reconstruction of communications and trade in the post-Roman and early medieval world, built from an analysis of thousands of individual data points, papyrus documents, coin finds, ship movements, hagiographic account of travel, inscriptions recording the movements of merchants and pilgrims and diplomats. What McCormick found was not darkness. He found a world that was, in the 7th and 8th centuries, significantly less commercially active than the Roman world that preceded it. That part of the old story is not wrong. The volume of long-distance trade contracted. The density of urban life declined in most of Western Europe. The circulation of luxury goods narrowed, but it did not stop. The networks persisted in reduced form, maintained by particular classes of people. Pilgrims traveling to Rome and Jerusalem, diplomats moving between the Frankish courts in Constantinople and the early Islamic Caliphate, merchants trading in specific high-value commodities, slaves, and raw materials, and the church, whose institutional connections spanned the entire post-Roman world, and whose correspondence networks kept a certain minimal level of communication alive across distances that would otherwise have been insuperable. McCormick's reconstruction shows, among many other things, that in the 8th and 9th centuries, there was a significant intensification of economic activity across Western Europe. Not a recovery to Roman levels, but a genuine expansion of commercial networks that prefigures the better documented commercial revolution of the 11th and 12th centuries. This intensification is visible in the coin record, in the growth of emporia, trading settlements, often coastal, that specialize in the exchange of goods, and in the documentary evidence for craft production and market activity in Carolingian Francia. The story, in other words, was not flat. It had shape. It had movement. It had moments of contraction and moments of expansion, regional variation, and long-term trend. Now, let the breath slow for a moment. Let that network of coins and ships and pilgrims settle into something quieter. Let the names rest. The dates can wait. There is no urgency in any of this. The coins are still in the museum cases. The ship timbers are still in the soil of Suffolk or in the storage rooms at the British Museum. The story is not going anywhere. Just breathe. And when you are ready, we will go to a different kind of evidence altogether. Not metal, not trade. Something made of skin and ink. The Codex Amiatinus is the oldest surviving complete manuscript of the Latin Bible. It was produced at the twin monasteries of Wearmouth and Jarrow, in what is now the northeast of England, sometime between approximately 690 and 715. The monasteries have been founded by a man named Benedict Biscop, who made 5 separate journeys to Rome over the course of his life, and brought back on each journey books, relics, artwork, and craftspeople, including glaziers, which is to say workers in stained glass, a craft that had become rare in Britain, and which Benedict Biscop specifically sought out in order to teach it again to English craftsmen. The abbot Ceolfrith, who succeeded Benedict Biscop and who presided over production of the Codex Amiatinus, commissioned not 1, but 3 complete copies of the Bible. 2 were intended for the monastery libraries. The 3rd was to be a gift to the Pope in Rome. In 716, Ceolfrith set out on the journey to Rome, carrying the 3rd copy of the Bible with him. He was elderly by this point. The sources suggest he was in his late 70s, and he died en route in Burgundy before reaching his destination. But his companions completed the journey, and the Bible was delivered. That 3rd copy is the Codex Amiatinus. It eventually came to rest at the Abbey of Monte Amiata in Tuscany, from which it takes its name, and it is now held at the Biblioteca Medicia Lorenziana in Florence, where it is catalogued as MS Amiatinus I. It weighs approximately 34 kilograms. It contains over 1,030 individual pages of prepared calfskin. The quality of the script, a form of uncial hand considered by paleographers to be among the finest examples of insular bookmaking, and the sophistication of the illumination suggests a scriptorium working at a level of technical accomplishment that demands serious reckoning. The scholar Rosamund McKitterick, professor of medieval history at the University of Cambridge and the author of multiple foundational studies on literacy and manuscript culture in the early medieval period, including her 2004 work History and Memory in the Carolingian World and her broader survey perceptions of the past in the early Middle Ages, has argued consistently that the evidence of manuscript production across the post-Roman West reveals not a broken tradition, but a transformed one. The centers of literacy shifted. The language of scholarship narrowed in Western Europe to Latin, while vernacular traditions developed alongside it rather than replacing it. The institutions that housed learning changed from the secular schools of the Roman world to the monastic scriptoria and cathedral schools of the Christian Church. But the learning did not stop. What the Codex Amiatinus represents, this massive, carefully planned, extraordinarily executed object made in a monastery on the edge of the North Sea by craftspeople who had learned their skills from masters brought back from Rome and Gaul, is the persistence of tradition under pressure, not its extinction, its continuation in a new form, in a new kind of institution, by people who understood themselves as participants in something larger than their own generation. 50 miles south of Wearmouth and Jarrow, give or take, lived a man who was arguably the most important scholar in 8th century Europe. His name was Bede. We know him today as the Venerable Bede, a title of respect that was attached to his name within a generation of his death and has remained there ever since. He was born somewhere in the vicinity of the monasteries at Wearmouth and Jarrow around 673, was given the care of the monastery as a child oblate at the age of 7, and spent virtually his entire life within a radius of a few miles of where he was born. He never traveled. He did not need to. His library came to him. The library that Benedict Biscop had assembled through his 5 journeys to Rome, a collection that included works of scripture, patristics, classical history, natural science, and computistics, was available to Bede from his earliest years. He read everything. He read in Latin and in some Greek. He wrote commentary on almost every book of the Bible. He wrote about grammar and metrics and the nature of time. He wrote a work called the Natura Rerum, on the nature of things, which drew on the encyclopedic tradition of Pliny the Elder and Isidore of Seville to explain the physical world as a Christian scholar understood it. He wrote a work on the computation of time, the De Temporum Ration, which remained a standard reference for the reckoning of the liturgical calendar for centuries after his death. And he wrote the Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum, the ecclesiastical history of the English people, which he completed in 731 and which is, by almost any measure, one of the most important works of historical writing in the early medieval period. Not because it is without bias, Bede writes as a churchman, with a churchman's concerns and commitments, and his account of the Christianization of the English kingdoms reflects those commitments throughout. But because of the care with which he evaluated his sources, because of the methodological seriousness with which he distinguished between what he had witnessed, what he had been told by credible informants, and what he had found in written documents, because of the sophistication of his understanding that historical evidence exists in layers, and that those layers must be handled differently. The historian Walter Goffart, emeritus professor at the University of Toronto and one of the most rigorous scholars of the early medieval period, has written that Bede's historical method represents a genuine intellectual achievement, one that cannot be adequately explained simply as the transmission of a classical model. Bede was doing something new with the tools he had inherited. He was thinking historically. In a monastery in Northumbria, in the 7th decade after the last Roman emperor of the West had been deposed. Let us move now from the written to the mechanical, because one of the most persistent elements of the darkness myth is the idea that the post-Roman world was technologically stagnant, that the collapse of Roman administrative and economic infrastructure meant the collapse of technological development, and that innovation did not resume until the later medieval period or the Renaissance. This is, as it happens, one of the areas where the evidence is most directly contradictory to the myth. Lynn White Jr., professor of history at the University of California at Los Angeles, and the author of what remains one of the foundational texts in the history of medieval technology and social change, published in 1962, made the argument that the early medieval period saw a cluster of agricultural innovations whose long-term effects on European productivity and population were profound. The most important of these was the heavy plow. The Roman plow, the ard, was a relatively simple implement. It scratched the surface of the soil, breaking it up enough for cultivation in the light, dry soils of the Mediterranean basin, where it was designed to work. But in the heavier, wetter, clay-rich soils of northern Europe, the soils of what is now northern France, Germany, the Low Countries, England north of the Thames, the ard was inadequate. It could not turn the soil over. It could not break the dense sod that characterized those landscapes. And without the ability to turn the soil, the full agricultural potential of those lands remained inaccessible. The heavy plow, the karuka, as it appears in contemporary sources, was a fundamentally different machine. It had a coulter, a vertical iron blade that cut to the sod ahead of the plowshare. It had an asymmetric mow board that turned the cut soil over, burying weeds and aerating the earth. It required more draft power than the ard, typically a team of oxen, and later, as horse harnesses improved, horses. But the agricultural return on that investment was enormous. The timing and geography of the heavy plow spread across northern Europe is a matter of ongoing archaeological and historical investigation. White's original chronology has been revised in several particulars by later scholars, including Georges Duby, the French medievalist whose work on agrarian history remains essential, and more recently by Grenville Astle of the University of Reading, whose archaeological studies of rural settlement in early medieval Britain have added considerable precision to our understanding of when and how new agricultural techniques spread. But the fundamental point stands. In the post-Roman centuries, in the regions that the darkness myth characterizes as collapsed and stagnant, European farmers were developing and deploying new agricultural technology that transformed the productivity of northern European soils and laid a material foundation for the population growth and urban expansion of the high medieval period. This does not happen in darkness. This happens in a world where people are working, observing, adapting, teaching each other, and investing in the most practical and unglamorous sense possible in the future. The watermill is another piece of this picture. The Roman world knew the watermill. We have evidence of Roman watermills from as early as the 1st century before the Common Era, and archaeological remains of Roman mill complexes have been found at sites across the former empire. But in the early medieval period, the spread of water-powered grain milling appears to have accelerated significantly, particularly in Ireland, England, and northern Francia. The historian Adam Lucas, in his 2006 study Wind, Water, Work, Ancient and Medieval Milling Technology, documents the expansion of watermill construction across Western Europe in the early medieval period with considerable precision. Archaeological evidence, combined with the documentary record, charters, hagiographic texts, and ultimately the evidence of the Doomsday Book, the Great Survey of England commissioned by William the Conqueror in 1086, reveals a landscape thickly populated with water-powered mills by the early medieval period. The Doomsday Book records 5,624 watermills in England in 1086. 5,624. In a country whose population at that time has been estimated at somewhere between 1.5 million and 2 million people. That is not a landscape that has forgotten how to harness mechanical power. That is a landscape that has integrated water-powered milling into the basic infrastructure of everyday food production to a degree that rivals anything in the Roman world. The windmill, it should be noted, comes slightly later. The earliest firm documentary evidence for windmills in Western Europe dates to the late 12th century, and the technology may have reached Europe from the Islamic world, though this remains a matter of scholarly debate. But the windmill's rapid spread across northern Europe in the high medieval period was built on a foundation of mechanical knowledge and craft tradition that had been developing throughout the preceding centuries. Let the mills turn for a moment in the dark behind your eyes. The sound of water on a wheel, the low rumble of stone on stone, grain becoming flour in the dark interior of a building that no longer exists, in a valley that you will never see, turning because someone in the 6th or 7th century built a channel and set a wheel and found that the river would do the work. Let that sound be there, quiet, continuous, and let the next thought come slowly as it wants to. We have been in the West so far this evening, in England and Italy and the monasteries of the North Sea coast. But the post-Roman world was not confined to Western Europe, and the story of what was happening in those centuries cannot be told without moving east, far east, to Constantinople first, the city that the Emperor Constantine had founded in 330 on the site of the older Greek city of Byzantium, on the narrow strait where Europe and Asia very nearly touch, had been for 2 centuries the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. The empire that never fell, that continued calling itself Roman for 1,000 years after the last emperor of the West was deposed in 476. In 537, the Emperor Justinian I completed the construction of the Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, in Constantinople. The Hagia Sophia is a building whose dimensions and engineering still occasion serious study by structural architects. The central dome is approximately 31 meters in diameter. The crown of the dome rises approximately 55 meters above the floor. The building was the largest enclosed space in the world for nearly 1,000 years after its construction. The structural solution that the architects Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus developed to transition from the square base of the building to the circular dome, a system of pendentives, curved triangular sections of masonry that carry the weight of the dome outward and downward appears, represents a genuine architectural innovation, one that had no precise precedent in classical Roman building, and that was not equal in scale or refinement in Western Europe for centuries. The building still stands. You can visit it today. You can stand inside it and look up at the dome and feel something that is very difficult to put into words, which is a sensation of an idea made physically present. The idea that human beings in the 6th century, working with stone and brick and lead and gold mosaic, could make a space that large feel somehow intimate. The scholar Averil Cameron, emeritus professor at the University of Oxford and one of the foremost authorities on Byzantine history and culture, her Procopius in the 6th century, her multi-volume Cambridge Ancient History chapters, and her broader synthesis The Byzantines Remain Essential Reading, has argued throughout her work that the Eastern Roman Empire must be understood not as a mere custodian of classical antiquity, but as a creative civilization in its own right. Byzantine theology, Byzantine law, Byzantine art and architecture were not simply Roman inheritance preserved under glass. They were living traditions, developing and changing and producing new things across the centuries of their existence. This matters enormously for the story of the Dark Ages, because one of the most common versions of the darkness myth acknowledges that the East survived. How could it not, given that Constantinople stood until 1453? While treating the Eastern Empire as essentially a storage facility for classical knowledge, preserving Greek texts until the Renaissance scholars were ready to receive them. A kind of cosmic lending library, stocked with Aristotle and Plato, waiting for the West to come and check them out. This is a significant misreading. The Eastern Empire was not waiting. It was working. Its scholars were not merely copying. They were commenting, disputing, extending, and in some cases fundamentally revising the intellectual traditions they had inherited. Its legal scholars produced the Corpus Juris Civilis, the great codification of Roman law completed under Justinian's direction in 534, which would become the foundation of legal systems across most of continental Europe. Its theologians produced sophisticated philosophical work that engaged seriously with the Greek philosophical tradition. Its military engineers and architects produced innovations in fortification and construction that influenced building practice across the Mediterranean world. Its diplomatic corps maintained, through centuries of pressure from multiple directions, Sassanid Persians from the east, Slavic and Avar peoples from the north, and eventually Arab armies in the south, a functional, literate, administratively sophisticated state in a region where such states were genuinely difficult to maintain. The Eastern Roman Empire was not dark. It was busy, and its busyness kept the Eastern Mediterranean world in a condition of relative urban and commercial vitality that provided one of the essential contexts for the next, most remarkable story of those centuries. In 610, a merchant from Mecca in the Arabian Peninsula, a man named Muhammad ibn Abdullah, reported that he had received the first of a series of revelations that would, over the following 23 years, be recorded in Arabic and compiled into the text known as the Quran. By 632, the year of Muhammad's death, the new religious movement he had founded had unified most of the Arabian Peninsula under a single political and religious authority. By 636, Arab armies had defeated the Byzantine forces at the Battle of Yarmouk and taken control of Syria and Palestine. By 642, they had conquered Egypt. By 711, Arab and Berber forces had crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and begun the conquest of the Iberian Peninsula. In less than a century, an entirely new political and cultural world had come into existence, stretching from the Atlantic coast of Spain to the borders of China. And within that world, something was happening that has no parallel in the same period anywhere in Europe west of Constantinople. The historian Jim Al-Khalili, professor of physics at the University of Surrey and the author of the 2011 book The House of Wisdom, How Arabic Science Saved Ancient Knowledge and Gave Us the Renaissance, describes in careful detail the emergence of what he calls a translation movement, a systematic, state-sponsored, institutionally supported effort to translate the philosophical and scientific works of the Greek, Persian, and Indian traditions into Arabic, which began in earnest in the 8th century and continued for over 200 years. The institution at the center of this effort was the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, in Baghdad, the new capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, founded in 762 by the Caliph al-Mansur on the western bank of the Tigris River, under the Caliphs Harun al-Rashid, who ruled from 786 to 809, and especially his son al-Mamun, who ruled from 813 to 833. The House of Wisdom became arguably the most important intellectual institution in the world. Scholars traveled to Baghdad from across the Islamic world and beyond. Translators worked simultaneously in Arabic, Greek, Persian, Syriac, and Sanskrit, rendering the works of Aristotle and Galen, and Euclid and Ptolemy into Arabic with a care and philosophical precision that often produced translations superior in certain respects to the originals, or rather, to the copies of the originals that had survived. Mathematicians from the Indian subcontinent brought with them a numerical notation system that the Islamic world would refine and eventually transmit to Europe, where we still call the digits we use everyday Arabic numerals. Among the scholars working in Baghdad in the early 9th century was a man named Muhammad ibn Musa al-Khwarizmi. He was a mathematician and astronomer employed at the House of Wisdom under Al-Ma'mun. Around 820, he wrote a work whose Arabic title is Kitab al-Muqtasar fi Hizb al-Jabr wal Muqabala, the compendious book on calculation by completion and balancing. The word al-Jabr in that title is the origin of the word algebra, and the Latinized form of al-Khwarizmi's own name is the origin of the word algorithm. These are not historical footnotes. They are the foundations of modern mathematics. They were produced in Baghdad in the early 9th century, in what the old label would have us believe was the middle of the Dark Ages. Somewhere in the darkness behind your eyes, let a candle be lit, not a dramatic flame, just a small, specific flame of a lamp on a desk in a room in a city on a river, and a man bending over a page covered in a script you cannot read, working through a problem about numbers that will eventually, centuries later, by routes and transmissions we will trace in the hours ahead, become part of the language your phone uses to find your location, and your bank uses to process your money, and the medical scanner uses to read the interior of your body. That flame has been burning for over 1,000 years. It was never extinguished. It was only, for a time, burning somewhere you were not looking. There is a particular moment in the history of scholarship when a field turns on itself, not destructively, not in the way of a crisis or scandal, but in the quieter, more productive way of a discipline that has accumulated enough evidence to look back at its own assumptions and say, with the calm of genuine intellectual confidence, we need to revise this. The revision is not a repudiation. It is a deepening. The old story was not entirely wrong. It was incomplete. And the incompleteness, it turns out, was systematic, organized around a set of assumptions that seemed obvious at the time they were made, and that only became visible as assumptions when the evidence began to accumulate in ways that those assumptions could not accommodate. This is precisely what happened to the historiography of the early medieval period across the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st. And the story of how it happened, of which scholars made which arguments, on the basis of which evidence, and how those arguments were received and contested and refined, is itself one of the more interesting stories in modern intellectual life. The scholarly consensus, based on a generation of archaeological excavation, manuscript cataloging, environmental reconstruction, and quantitative economic history, tells us that the post-Roman world was more economically active, more technologically innovative, more intellectually productive, and more geographically connected than the traditional Dark Ages narrative allowed. This is not a fringe position. It is the working assumption of most professional medievalists today. The revised picture is the mainstream picture, at least within the academy. But there's another reading, one that is less certain but more evocative, a reading that asks not just what the evidence shows, but why the old picture was so persistent, so persuasive, so deeply embedded in educational systems and popular culture that it continues to shape how most people outside the academy understand those centuries. Why, if the evidence for activity and innovation and connection was always there, in the ground, in the libraries, in the coin hoards, and the manuscript collections, did it take so long to be assembled into a coherent alternative narrative? That question, which sits at the edge of the evidence rather than securely within it, is where the most interesting thinking is happening. And a third possibility, one that neither the skeptical scholar nor the enthusiast tends to fully embrace, is this: that the darkness myth was not simply an error and not simply a lie, but something more interesting than either. A genuine perception, accurate within certain limits, that became catastrophically overgeneralized. That the people who coined and elaborated the darkness label were responding to something real, real contraction, real loss, real discontinuity in specific regions and specific domains, and that the error was not in noticing those things, but in making them the whole story. Let us take each of these positions seriously in turn. The mainstream scholarly view begins, as all good historical arguments must, with the primary evidence. And the primary evidence for the early medieval period is more abundant, more varied, and more revealing than a generation of undergraduate textbooks would suggest. Start with the archaeology of settlement. Chris Wickham, Chichely Professor of Medieval History at the University of Oxford and the author of the 2005 work Framing the Early Middle Ages, a book that runs to nearly 1,000 pages and synthesizes the archaeological and documentary evidence for the post-Roman world across Europe, North Africa, and the Near East with a comprehensiveness that no previous single work had attempted, makes a series of arguments that are, taken together, a fundamental challenge to the simple darkness model. Wickham's central analytical category is what he calls the peasant mode of production. He argues that in much of post-Roman Western Europe, the retreat of the complex Roman economic system, with its long-distance trade, its monetized markets, its specialized craft production, its densely interconnected supply chains, represented not simply a collapse, but a transformation in the organization of economic life. The peasant communities that formed the basic productive units of early medieval Europe were not the remnants of a broken system. They were a different system organized around different priorities, operating at different scales, and generating different kinds of surplus. This distinction matters because it changes what counts as evidence of economic life. If you are looking for the markers of Roman-style commercial complexity, amphora distributions, coin concentrations, urban market facilities, you'll find less of them in the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries in Western Europe, and you may conclude that economic life has contracted dramatically, and in some important senses it has. Wickham does not deny this. But if you look at the evidence for local production, local exchange, local craft specialization, and local surplus generation, the material record of communities feeding, housing, clothing, and equipping themselves and doing so with genuine skill and organizational capacity, a different picture emerges. One of resilience, of adaptation, of communities that have lost access to certain kinds of goods and certain kinds of markets, but have not lost the fundamental human capacity for productive organization. The archaeologist Helena Haimrow, professor at the University of Oxford and the author of Early Medieval Settlements, The Archaeology of Rural Communities in Northwest Europe, for 100 and 900, has spent decades excavating and analyzing the physical remains of early medieval villages in England, Germany, and the Low Countries. Her work reveals a landscape that was continuously inhabited, continuously farmed, and continuously organized, not a landscape of abandoned ruins and scattered survivors, but one of functioning communities adapting to new political and economic circumstances. The settlements themselves changed. The large villa complexes of the Roman period gave way to smaller, more dispersed patterns of habitation. The building materials shifted in many regions, from stone to timber, not because the inhabitants had forgotten how to work stone, but because timber construction was better suited to the scale and mobility of early medieval social organization, which involved a degree of settlement movement and rebuilding that the more permanent Roman villa economy did not require. The shift from stone to timber in post-Roman Britain has sometimes been read as evidence of technological regression. Haimrow's analysis suggests it is better understood as evidence of technological adaptation. But here the evidence becomes genuinely contested, and it is worth pausing to acknowledge that. The question of how to interpret the archaeological record of the post-Roman period is not settled. There are real scholarly disagreements, pursued with real intellectual seriousness, about how much weight to give to different kinds of evidence, about how to model population change and economic contraction, about whether persistence of local agricultural communities represents continuity or simply a floor below which collapse cannot go. The historian Brian Ward Perkins, fellow of Trinity College, Oxford, and the author of The Fall of Rome and the End of Civilization, published in 2005, represents the most rigorous version of what might be called a continuity skeptic position. Ward Perkins does not endorse the romantic darkness narrative. He is far too careful a scholar for that. But he insists, against what he sees as a tendency in contemporary medieval studies to minimize or normalize the disruptions of the 5th and 6th centuries, that the archaeological evidence for genuine economic collapse in Western Europe is compelling and should not be explained away. His most striking piece of evidence is the ceramic record. In Roman Britain, as in most of the Western provinces, ordinary household pottery was produced by specialist craftspeople working in dedicated production centers and distributing their products across wide regional networks. The pottery itself was wheel-thrown, kiln-fired, and produced to consistent standards of quality. You can find the same types of vessel, the same forms, the same fabric, the same surface treatments across enormous distances, because they were all coming from the same organized production centers. In post-Roman Britain, this changes dramatically. By the late 5th and early 6th century, wheel-thrown, kiln-fired pottery has effectively disappeared from the archaeological record across most of the island. It is replaced, where pottery is used at all, by handmade vessels of much less consistent quality, produced locally, not distributed widely. And in many areas, pottery itself is simply absent from the record, suggesting that communities were using organic containers, wooden bowls, and leather vessels that leave no archaeological trace. Ward Perkins interprets this not as a different kind of economic organization, but as a genuine decline in the complexity and productivity of economic life. And he argues, carefully and with real force, that the impulse to reframe every piece of negative evidence as evidence of a different rather than a lesser system risks a kind of intellectual sentimentality, a reluctance to acknowledge that things can get genuinely worse, that real skills can be genuinely lost, that complexity, once unraveled, does not automatically reassemble itself. He is right about this in a specific and important way. The scholarly consensus, as represented by Wickham and others, does not actually deny that economic complexity declined. What it argues, and what the evidence supports, is that the decline was uneven, regionally variable, and temporally bounded. The nadir of Western European economic life appears to have been in the late 5th and 6th centuries. By the 7th and 8th centuries, a recovery is underway in many regions, a recovery that Ward Perkins himself, writing carefully, does not dispute. What the two positions disagree about is more subtle, whether the recovery represents a return, a continuation, or something genuinely new. And that question, which is as much philosophical as empirical, is one that the evidence alone cannot fully resolve. A third possibility, and perhaps the most intellectually honest one, is that it was all three simultaneously in different regions and different domains, and that the very desire to find a single characterizing label for those centuries, dark or not dark, collapsed or transformed, is itself part of the problem, part of the legacy of a way of thinking about history that wants periods to have essences, to be something rather than being the messy, multidirectional, locally variable processes that all eras, including our own, actually are. Let that tension rest for a moment. The debate between Ward Perkins and Wickham, between collapse and transformation, is not one that needs to be resolved tonight. It has been running in the journals and the conferences for decades. Let it run. Let the arguments settle somewhere at the edge of hearing, like voices in another room. You do not need to decide. Neither do I. What we can do is keep moving through the evidence and let the picture accumulate. The story of the Islamic Golden Age, which we touched on briefly in the preceding section, deserves considerably more attention than it typically receives in Western accounts of the early medieval period. The scholarly consensus, based on a rich and well-preserved documentary material record, tells us that the intellectual culture of the Abbasid Caliphate, centered in Baghdad in the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries, represents one of the most concentrated episodes of scientific and philosophical activity in the pre-modern world. This is not a contested position. It is, among historians of science, simply a description of what the evidence shows. But there is another reading, one that is less certain but more evocative, which is that the Islamic Golden Age was not merely concurrent with the European Dark Ages, but was, in a precise and traceable historical sense, one of the mechanisms by which the knowledge that the darkness narrative mourns was preserved and extended, that the so-called rescue of classical learning by the Renaissance humanists who traveled east to find Greek manuscripts was, in significant measure, a recovery of texts that had been translated into Arabic, commented on by Arabic scholars, extended and in some cases corrected by Arabic scholars, and only then retranslated back into Latin for Western European consumption. This is not a warm and fuzzy story about cultural exchange and mutual respect, though the history contains some of that. It is a precise empirical claim about the transmission of specific texts through specific institutional channels, and it is well documented. The Arabic translation of Aristotle's works, produced by scholars including Hunayn ibn Ishaq, a Nestorian Christian physician and translator who worked in Baghdad in the 9th century and was arguably the most prolific and technically accomplished translator of the entire movement, were the versions that European scholars primarily worked from when Aristotelian philosophy began its transformative entry into European universities in the 12th and 13th centuries. When Thomas Aquinas built his great synthesis of Christian theology and Aristotelian philosophy in the 13th century, he was working from Latin translations of Arabic translations of Greek texts. The Arabic intermediary was not incidental. In many cases, it was where the serious scholarly commentary resided. Hunayn Ibn Ishaq translated, among other works, Galen's medical writings, the same writings that Cassiodorus had been reading in his monastery in Squillace. He produced translations of such quality that later Arabic scholars described them as a standard against which other translations were measured. He also wrote his own original medical works, including a treatise on ophthalmology, the 10 treatises on the eye. That was the most comprehensive account of the anatomy and diseases of the eye produced anywhere in the world up to that point, and that would remain a significant reference work for centuries. The mathematician Al-Khwarizmi, whose algebra we mentioned earlier, was working in tradition that drew on Indian mathematical knowledge, particularly the decimal positional number system and the concept of zero, which came to the Islamic world from India, and Greek mathematical traditions, particularly the work of Diophantus at Alexandria, and wove them into something genuinely new. His work on algebra was not a translation or a commentary. It was an original synthesis, creating a new mathematical domain that neither of its parent traditions had possessed. The astronomer al-Battani, working in the Syrian city of Raqqa in the late 9th and early 10th centuries, produced astronomical observations and calculations of precision that corrected errors in Ptolemy's Almagest, errors that had persisted undetected, because no one in the intervening centuries had had the mathematical tools and the observational discipline to find them. Al-Battani's determination of the length of the solar year was accurate to within 2 minutes and 24 seconds. He calculated the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis that causes the celestial poles to trace a circle over a period of approximately 26,000 years, with a precision that surpassed Ptolemy's original figure. These are not approximations. They are measurements, made with instruments, checked against observation, subjected to mathematical analysis. In the 9th century, the physician Ibn Sina, known in the Latin West as Avicenna, was born in what is now Uzbekistan in 980. By the time he died in 1037, he had produced an intellectual output that is, by any measure, extraordinary. His Canon of Medicine, the Kitab al-Canon fi al-Tib, is a systematic encyclopedia of medical knowledge that integrates Greek, Persian, and original clinical observation into a coherent framework. It is organized with a logical rigor that reflects his deep engagement with Aristotelian philosophy, which he had mastered by the age of 18, according to his own account. The Canon of Medicine was translated into Latin in the 12th century by Gerard of Cremona, who worked in Toledo in Iberia, in the part of the continent that had been under Islamic rule since 711, and whose intellectual culture was, by the 12th century, the primary transmission point for Arabic language learning into Western Europe. Gerard of Cremona is said to have translated over 80 Arabic works into Latin over the course of his career, making him one of the most consequential single individuals in the history of European intellectual life. After its translation, the Canon of Medicine became a standard text in European medical education. It was taught at the medical faculties of Bologna, Montpellier, and Paris. It was reprinted more than 30 times in the century following the invention of the printing press. It remained required text in some European medical schools into the 17th century. This is the shape of the transmission. Not a simple rescue of classical texts from a dark vault, a complex, centuries-long process of translation, commentary, synthesis, and innovation, moving through Baghdad and Cordoba and Toledo and Palermo and Salerno, carried by individual scholars and institutional networks, generating new knowledge at every stage rather than simply passing the old knowledge along unchanged. The darkness narrative cannot accommodate this, because the darkness narrative requires the post-classical world to have been an interruption, a pause in the long progress of human knowledge between ancient and modern. But what actually happened was not a pause. It was a detour, if you want to use a spatial metaphor. The main road of European learning, the road that ran from Athens to Rome to Florence, went underground for a time in the West, and meanwhile the ideas that had been traveling on that road were being carried by other travelers, on different roads, through different cities, being changed and developed and extended in ways that the original classical sources had not anticipated. And then, in the 12th and 13th centuries, those changed and developed and extended ideas came back. Through Toledo, through Sicily, where the Norman kings of the 12th century maintained a court that was trilingual in Latin, Greek, and Arabic, and where scholars from all three traditions worked in proximity, that generated a remarkable intellectual ferment. Through the Crusader states of the Levant, where European scholars encountered the Arabic language intellectual tradition in its home environment, and through Constantinople, when the Turkish conquest of that city in 1453 sent Byzantine scholars west with their manuscripts, which included, of course, not only Greek originals, but centuries of Byzantine commentary and Arabic translations of texts that had not survived in Greek. The Renaissance humanists who celebrated themselves as the rescuers of classical learning were not wrong that something important was happening. They were wrong about who had been keeping it alive. Let the roads run for a moment. Baghdad to Toledo, Toledo to Paris, Paris to Florence, and sideways from all of them, the roads that run to places a standard story rarely visits. To Cordoba, where in the 10th century the Caliph Abd al-Rahman III and his son al-Hakam II assembled a library that contemporaries claimed held over 400,000 volumes, a figure that modern scholars treat cautiously, but that even at a fraction of its claimed size would represent an accumulation of written knowledge with no parallel in the contemporary Latin West. To Samarkand and to Nishapur, the great eastern cities of the Islamic world where the mathematical and astronomical traditions continued developing independently of the Baghdad center. To the Fatimid court in Cairo, where in 972 Al-Azhar was founded, the mosque university that is still operating today, making it one of the oldest continuously functioning educational institutions in the world. Let those roads run. And somewhere in the soft geography of half-sleep, let them converge in a monastery garden, because we need to return now to Western Europe, to the monasteries and the scriptoria and the cathedral schools that were, in their quieter and less well-resourced way, doing something analogous to what the House of Wisdom was doing in Baghdad. The scholarly consensus, based on the paleographic analysis of thousands of medieval manuscripts and the institutional records of monastic communities across Western Europe, tells us that the preservation and transmission of Latin learning in the early medieval period was primarily the work of monasteries. This is not a controversial claim. The monastic scriptorium, the room set aside for the copying and production of manuscripts, is the central institution of early medieval literacy in the West, and its importance is well established. But there's another reading, one that is less certain but more evocative, which is that the monasteries were not merely passive custodians of a fixed textual inheritance, but active participants in an ongoing intellectual culture that was generating new knowledge, new synthesis, and new frameworks of understanding even as it preserved the old ones. Consider the Carolingian Renaissance. This is a term used by historians to describe a cluster of intellectual and institutional developments associated with the court of the Frankish king Charlemagne, who was crowned Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day in the year 800 in Rome. The term Renaissance is, in this context, slightly misleading. It implies a recovery from a preceding darkness, which is precisely the framing we are examining. But what it describes is real. Charlemagne, who was himself apparently unable to write with fluency. Sources suggest he could read Latin but struggled to form the letters, a detail that has been much discussed, was nevertheless genuinely committed to the promotion of learning. He invited scholars from across the known world to his court at Aachen. Alcuin of York, the most eminent English scholar of his generation, who had been educated at the Cathedral School of York, where Bede's intellectual legacy was still living. Theodulf of Orleans, a Visigothic scholar-bishop of considerable learning. Paul the Deacon, the Lombard historian who produced the Historia Langobardorum, a history of the Lombard people that remains one of our primary sources for early medieval Italian history, and others from Iberia, Ireland, and the Italian peninsula. This court was not merely decorative. Alcuin's correspondence. Hundreds of letters survive, edited by Ernst Dummler in the Monumenta Germaniae Historica, the great 19th and 20th century project of editing and publishing medieval primary sources that is housed in Munich and remains one of the foundational resources of medieval scholarship, reveals an intellectual community of genuine seriousness. Alcuin was revising the text of the Latin Bible, standardizing the liturgy, reforming the system of script used in royal chanceries. His role in the development and spread of the Carolingian minuscule, the clear, elegant handwriting system that replaced the various regional and often difficult-to-read scripts of the preceding centuries, cannot be overstated. The Carolingian minuscule is a direct ancestor of the lowercase letter forms you are reading right now, on whatever screen carries these words. The letters you are reading, the specific shapes of the A and the E and the G and the M, were standardized in a scriptorium in late 8th century Francia. This is not darkness. This is design. The historian Rosamund McKitterick, whom we met earlier in this account, has argued in her Carolingians, the Frankish kings and the shaping of Europe that the Carolingian court and the institutions it promoted represented a genuine cultural program, a self-conscious effort to create and sustain an educated clergy capable of administering the church and transmitting Christian learning to subsequent generations. The scale of manuscript production in Carolingian monasteries is documented by the surviving manuscripts themselves. Thousands of codices that can be localized to specific scriptoria, many of them identifiable by their scripts and decorative programs, produced across the late 8th and 9th centuries. Among these are copies of works that would otherwise have been lost. The Carolingian scriptoria copied not only religious texts, but the works of Roman authors, Virgil, Cicero, Tacitus, Suetonius, Livy, the scholar Lucio Russo, in his work The Forgotten Revolution, and more directly the classical philologist Leighton Reynolds, whose Text and Transmission, a survey of the Latin classics, remains a foundational reference work. Both document the dependency of our knowledge of classical Latin literature on medieval manuscript transmission. Most of what we have of Roman literature, the majority of the texts we think of when we think of classical antiquity, survives because monks in Carolingian and post-Carolingian scriptoria copied them, not because they were necessarily enthusiastic about all of them. Some texts survive in forms that suggest the copy is found them morally questionable or intellectually puzzling. The sexual content of Ovid, the pagan theology of Virgil, the brutal frankness of certain historical accounts. These were copied anyway, because the institutional commitment to preservation was stronger than individual aesthetic or moral discomfort. This is not a trivial observation. It means that the preservation of classical antiquity was not purely a project of admiration. It was also a project of institutional discipline, of a tradition that had decided, for its own reasons, that the written word was sacred, that copying was prayer, that loss was irreversible, and that the monk at his desk was responsible, in some cosmic sense, for the continuity of human knowledge. Cassiodorus had that idea in Squillace in 554. The Carolingian scriptoria extended it across half a continent. 3 centuries later, a sleep reset now. Just a moment. The manuscripts are, in their cases, the scripts are still legible, if you know how to read them. The particular quality of the vellum, scraped clean of hair and fat, stretched on a frame, cut into sheets, folded and sewn into gatherings, is preserved under the controlled humidity of library storage rooms in Florence and Paris and Oxford and Munich and Dublin and 100 other cities. The words are not going anywhere. Let the words rest. Let your own thoughts drift away from the argument, from the dates and the names and the careful scholarly qualifications, and settle into something simpler. Someone in a cold room, by lamplight, made something that lasted. That is the whole story, in the smallest possible form. Let it be enough for a moment. When we come back, and there is no hurry, we should talk about Ireland. Because Ireland is one of the most remarkable chapters in the entire story of early medieval learning, and it is one that the darkness narrative handles very badly, mostly by ignoring it. Ireland had never been part of the Roman Empire. The Romans had reached the western coast of Britain, had even briefly crossed into Scotland, but they had not crossed the Irish Sea. And this means that when the Roman administrative and economic system collapsed in the 5th century, Ireland had nothing equivalent to collapse. There was no Roman infrastructure to lose. The social and political organization of Ireland continued largely along the lines it had been following before the first Roman soldier ever set foot on British soil. Clan-based, pastoral, locally organized, without significant urban centers, but also without the vulnerability that came from dependence on the kind of complex, interconnected economic system that Rome had built and that the 5th century disrupted so severely. Christianity arrived in Ireland in the 5th century, traditionally associated with the mission of the Romano-British Bishop Patricius, St. Patrick, but more accurately described as a gradual process involving multiple figures and multiple routes of influence. And when it arrived into a society that was literate in a limited sense. The Ogham script had been used for inscriptions, but that had no tradition of book culture, of large-scale manuscript production, of the kind of institutional learning that the Roman Church had developed in the former imperial territories. Within 2 centuries, Ireland had become one of the most important centers of learning in the Western world. The monasteries of early medieval Ireland, Clonmacnoise on the banks of the Shannon, founded in approximately 545 by St. Kieran, Bangor in County Down, founded by St. Comgall around 558, Iona, the island monastery off the Scottish coast founded by St. Columba in 563, Glendalough and the Wicklow Mountains, associated with St. Kevin, were not simply religious houses. They were schools, libraries, and scriptoria. They were places where young men came to learn Latin, not their native language, not a language with any local history on the island, but a language they mastered from books alone, with a particular intensity of people learning an entirely foreign tongue for the sole purpose of accessing a written tradition that they valued more than their own. The quality of the scholarship produced in these institutions is visible in the manuscripts they produced. The Book of Kells, now held at Trinity College Dublin, and arguably the most famous illuminated manuscript in the world, was produced on Iona or possibly in a scriptorium with close connections to Iona around 800. Its decorative program, the intricate knotwork, the zoomorphic forms, the carpet pages whose complexity seems to defy the capacity of the human hand to have made them, represents a fusion of the insular decorative tradition that had developed across Ireland and northern Britain with the Mediterranean iconographic program of early Christian manuscript art. But the Book of Kells is the most visible artifact of a tradition whose scholarly achievement goes considerably deeper than the visual. The Irish monasteries were producing original theological and philological work. They were producing the earliest vernacular literature in any Northern European language. The old Irish legal and poetic traditions that were committed to writing in the early medieval period represent a body of literature of considerable sophistication, recording a social and intellectual world of real complexity. They were producing peregrini, wandering scholars, who crossed the European continent and founded monasteries of their own. Columbanus, who established Luxeuil in Burgundy and Bobbio in northern Italy. Gallus, who established what became the Abbey of St. Gall in Switzerland. Virgil of Salzburg, who was born in Ireland, became Bishop of Salzburg in 745 and taught, to the scandal of some of his contemporaries, that the earth was spherical and that there were Antipodean peoples on the other side of it. Spherical earth. 8th century. Irish bishop. In the European heartland. In the middle of the Dark Ages. The evidence is in the sources. The accusation brought against Virgil by Boniface, the Anglo-Saxon missionary to the Germans who was scandalized by the doctrine, is recorded in a letter preserved in the Monumenta Germaniae Historica. The episode is discussed with characteristic precision by the historian Thomas O'Loughlin of the University of Nottingham in his work on early medieval cosmology. The Irish peregrini bring us to a point that the darkness narrative handles with particular awkwardness, which is a question of the movement of peoples across the post-Roman world. The narrative of the Dark Ages is built, in part, around an image of catastrophic migration, of barbarian peoples sweeping across the frontiers and destroying the settled civilization of the Roman world. The Visigoths sacking Rome in 410, the Vandals sacking it again in 455, the Huns driving populations before them across the Eurasian steppe, the Angles and Saxons displacing the Romano-British populations of what is now England. These events were real. The disruption they caused was real. And the scholarship of the past several decades, the work of Patrick Geary, whose Myth of Nations, the medieval origins of Europe challenges the nationalist narratives that later appropriated these migrations for political purposes, the work of Peter Heather, whose The Fall of the Roman Empire, a new history of Rome and the barbarians, presents the most detailed recent account of how the Western Empire came apart, has given us a much richer and more nuanced account of what these migrations actually involved. The scholarly consensus, based on a combination of documentary, archaeological, and increasingly genetic evidence, The ancient DNA studies that have transformed our understanding of population movement in the past decade are among the most exciting developments in contemporary historical scholarship. Tells us that the picture is complex. The migrations involved real population movement, real cultural disruption, real violence in specific times and places. But they also involved accommodation, intermarriage, the adoption and adaptation of Roman practices by incoming groups, and a continuation of significant Roman populations in most of the territories in question. Peter Heather's work is important here. He argues against a tendency in some post-war scholarship to minimize the migrations as essentially peaceful population mixing, that the external pressures on the Roman frontier were genuine military crises that the imperial government ultimately could not manage. But he also shows in considerable detail that the Germanic kingdoms that established themselves on former Roman territory were not simply replacements of Roman civilization with something entirely different. They were, in most cases, deeply Romanized entities: the Ostrogothic kingdom of Theodoric, the Visigothic kingdom of Iberia, the Frankish kingdom of Gaul, that maintained Roman administrative practice, Roman law in modified forms, Roman currency, Roman urban infrastructure, and a Roman cultural prestige that their kings were eager to associate themselves with. Theodoric the Great, the king whom the young Cassiodorus served, was a man who had been educated in Constantinople for 10 years as a hostage guarantor of Ostrogothic good behavior, who spoke Greek and Latin, who collected classical manuscripts, who built in the Roman architectural tradition at Ravenna, the remarkable mausoleum of Theodoric, still standing in Ravenna today, is one of the finest surviving examples of late antique architecture, and who wrote through the medium of Cassiodorus's elegant Latin letters and administrative documents of considerable rhetorical sophistication. Was he Roman? No. Was his kingdom a continuation of the Roman Empire? No, not in any strict political sense. But was it a civilization that had discarded Roman culture and retreated into darkness? The evidence in Ravenna answers that question. Walk through the Basilica of San Apollinaire Nuovo, with its gold mosaic processions that run the full length of the nave. Look at the baptistry of the Arians, with its dome mosaic of the baptism of Christ that is among the finest surviving examples of early medieval mosaic art. These were commissioned by Theodoric. They were made in a tradition that had been running, without interruption, from the late Roman period. A third possibility, and perhaps the most historically accurate one, is that Theodoric and his successors were genuinely something new. Not Roman, not simply Germanic, but a synthesis, a new kind of political and cultural entity that was trying to hold in tension two inheritances that did not fit together perfectly, and doing so with more success and more sophistication than the darkness narrative gives credit for. Let the gold of the mosaics rest behind your eyes for a moment. The particular quality of Byzantine gold mosaic, the way the individual tesserae are set at slightly varying angles so that the surface catches light from multiple directions and seems to pulse, is one of those aesthetic achievements that is very difficult to convey in words. It is a quality you have to see, or you have to imagine with specific and sympathetic effort of attention. The people who designed those mosaics knew what they were doing. They knew about light and surface and the angle of incidence. They had theories, not the mathematical theories of modern optics, but practical, craft-based theories that had been developed over generations of work about how to make a surface of glass and gold communicate something to a viewer standing on the floor below. They were not in darkness. They were working in gold and light. Let us speak now about agriculture more specifically, because the transformation of European farming in the early medieval period is one of the stories that has been most systematically overlooked, and its implications are among the most significant for understanding what the period was actually building toward. We mentioned the heavy plow earlier, but the heavy plow was part of a larger cluster of agricultural innovations whose combined effect on the productivity of northern European agriculture was, in the long run, transformative. The three-field system of crop rotation, in which arable land was divided into three sections, with one section under winter crops, one under spring crops, and one lying fallow, rotating annually, appears to become widespread in northern Europe in the Carolingian period. The agricultural historian George Duby, in his foundational work The Early Growth of the European Economy, Warriors and Peasants from the 7th to the 12th Century, published in French in 1973, argues that the spread of the three-field system represented a significant increase in agricultural productivity because it increased the proportion of land under cultivation in any given year from one-half under the older two-field system to two-thirds. The improved horse collar is another piece of this picture. The ancient world used a throat and girth harness for horses, which put pressure on the animal's windpipe when it pulled a heavy load, and thus severely limited the tractive power that could be drawn from a horse. The padded horse collar, which transfers the load from the throat to the shoulders and chest, allowing the horse to use its full body weight to pull without restriction, appears in the archaeological record of Europe in the early medieval period. Its origin is disputed. The technology may have come from Central Asia, possibly transmitted to the Avar peoples who settled in the Carpathian Basin in the late 6th century, but by the Carolingian period it is documented in manuscript illustrations of farming scenes. Combined with the nailed horseshoe, which appears in the same general period and prevents the wearing down of the hoof on hard ground, the improved harness made the horse a practical draft animal for heavy agricultural work for the first time in European history. Horses move faster than oxen, require less food per unit of tractive power on certain terrains, and can work longer days. The shift from oxen to horses as the primary draft animals of northern European agriculture, a shift that was underway in the Carolingian period and largely complete by the 11th century in many regions, represents an increase in agricultural productivity whose scale is difficult to quantify precisely, but is clearly significant. Lynn White Jr.'s original account of these developments has been revised in various particulars by later scholars, as we noted earlier. The historian John Langdon, in his detailed study Horses, Oxen, and Technological Innovation, the use of draft animals in English farming from 1000 to 1500, published in 1986, has complicated White's chronology and contested some of his causal arguments. The picture that has emerged from subsequent research is not as clean as White's original synthesis suggested. The timing of the adoption of new agricultural technologies varied significantly by region and by soil type. The social and institutional conditions required for certain innovations to spread were not present everywhere at the same time, but the fundamental trajectory holds. In the period between roughly 700 and 1200, northern European agriculture underwent a series of interrelated technological changes whose combined effect was to increase the productive capacity of the land and to support population growth and eventually urban expansion on a scale that the Mediterranean-centered Roman agricultural system had not achieved in those regions. This was happening in the Dark Ages, not despite the Dark Ages. In them, there is something I want to say here about the sociology of knowledge, about why these developments were not part of the standard account for so long. Agricultural history, the history of peasants and plows and crop rotation cycles, is not the kind of history that generates drama. It does not have battles or coronations or the deaths of kings. It does not have named individuals making decisive gestures in moments of crisis. It is a history of anonymous millions doing the same things, season after season, with incremental variations that accumulate into transformation over generations. The people who built the Dark Ages narrative, Petrarch, the humanists, the Enlightenment philosophes, were scholars and intellectuals who valued, above all things, the literary and philosophical culture of classical antiquity. They looked at the post-Roman world and asked, where are the Ciceros? Where are the Lucretiuses? Where are the great philosophical schools, the elaborate rhetorical tradition, the self-conscious literary culture of the classical world? And finding few equivalents in the West in the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries, they concluded that the light had gone out. But they were looking in the wrong place. They were looking for books when they should have been looking at fields. They were looking for rhetoric when they should have been looking at watermills. They were looking for philosophy when they should have been looking at the slow, unglamorous, extraordinarily consequential work of feeding more people more efficiently on the same amount of land. The historian Joel Moker, professor at Northwestern University and the author of a series of foundational works on the history of technology and economic growth, including The Lever of Riches, Technological Creativity and Economic Progress, and the Gifts of Athena, Historical Origins of the Knowledge Economy, has argued that the early medieval period should be understood as a phase of what he calls enabling innovations, changes in the basic productive infrastructure of agricultural and hydraulic technology that made later economic and demographic growth possible. These innovations were not glamorous. They were not the kind of achievements that get named and celebrated and built into cultural memory. But without them, the high medieval expansion, the growth of cities, the revival of long-distance trade, the building of cathedrals, the founding of universities could not have happened. The darkness myth, in other words, mistakes the visible for the real. It mistakes the silence of the literary record, the reduced production of self-consciously literary text in Latin, which is real and documentable, for a silence in the historical record as a whole. And because it looks for evidence of civilization in the wrong places, it finds less than there is. This brings us to the question of literacy itself, which is one of the most important and most contentious aspects of the darkness debate. The scholarly consensus, based on the documentary and manuscript evidence, tells us that literacy in the early medieval West was significantly more restricted than literacy in the Roman Empire at its height, and also significantly more restricted than literacy in the Islamic world in the same period. This is not disputed. The Roman world had schools, educated a significant proportion of its urban population in basic reading and writing, and produced a substantial volume of documentary material, contracts, legal instruments, private letters, administrative records, that required and reflected widespread practical literacy. In the post-Roman West, literacy contracted. The lay aristocracy of the Frankish and other Germanic kingdoms was largely illiterate in the early period, leaving written administration to clerics. The urban schools of the Roman world had disappeared in most regions. Basic literacy among the general population was probably lower in 7th century northern France than it had been in 2nd century northern France. But here the interesting claim opens up, and it is one worth taking seriously. The contraction of literacy in the early medieval West was not uniform, and the institutional form in which literacy survived, concentrated in monasteries and cathedral schools associated specifically with religious functions, had effects on the nature of what was written and preserved that were not simply negative. The monasteries produced, alongside the theological and devotional texts that were their primary literary output, an extraordinary range of other material. Historical chronicles, hagiographies that contain embedded information about daily life, economic conditions, and local culture of great value to modern historians, legal documents, charters, cartularies, property records, that constitute one of the richest sources for the economic and social history of the period, scientific and technical. Texts as computistical treatises, agricultural manuals, and as we have seen, copies of classical Latin literature that would otherwise be entirely lost. Moreover, the very restriction of literacy to institutional settings meant that the institutional investment in scribal training and manuscript production was, in some contexts, more intensive and more technically refined than the diffuse, practical literacy of the Roman world had been. The great insular manuscripts, the Lindisfarne Gospels, the Book of Kells, the Codex Amiatinus, are not the product of a culture that barely knows how to read and write. They are the products of a culture that has made literacy a central institutional commitment and has developed the craft of bookmaking to a level of technical and aesthetic refinement that has rarely been equaled anywhere in the world. The Lindisfarne Gospels, produced by a monk named Eadfrith on the island of Lindisfarne off the Northumbrian coast around 700, contains in its carpet pages decorative programs of such intricacy that modern scholars, examining them under magnification, have found details invisible to the naked eye. Whether these details were intended to be seen by human eyes at all, or whether they were made for God alone, is a question that the sources do not answer. But the making of them, the decision to work at that level of precision and care on details that no human viewer would ever see, tells us something about the quality of attention that the best early medieval scriptoria were capable of bringing to their work. This is not darkness. This is a specific and extraordinary kind of light, concentrated, intense, and very carefully directed. One more sleep reset. Let it come naturally, like a door swinging gently on its hinge. Somewhere tonight, in a temperature-controlled room, in a library that was itself built on the foundations of something much older, the Lindisfarne Gospels are resting in their case. The carpet pages with their invisible details are there in the dark, not being looked at by anyone. The gold and the pigment and the vellum are just persisting. Let that persistence be the last thought before the next thought comes. There is no hurry. The manuscripts waited 1,200 years to be looked at with electron microscopes. They can wait while you rest. We should talk now about the political structures of the early medieval period, because the darkness narrative has done particular damage to our understanding of this dimension of the post-Roman world. The standard picture is one of fragmentation. The unified administrative and legal structure of the Roman Empire replaced by a patchwork of competing kingdoms, tribal confederacies, and ecclesiastical lordships, with no effective central authority, no consistent rule of law, and no institutional framework capable of providing the public goods, security, property rights, dispute resolution that complex economic life requires. This picture is not entirely wrong. It is genuinely true that the post-Roman West lacked the administrative uniformity that the Roman Empire had provided, and that the political fragmentation of the period imposed real costs on trade, on security, on the mobility of people and goods. But there is another reading. The Germanic kingdoms that established themselves on former Roman territory were not simply negative spaces, gaps in a Roman structure waiting to be filled by a restored civilization. They were new political formations, genuinely new in certain respects, that were developing legal and institutional frameworks of their own. The Frankish legal tradition, codified in documents like the Salic Law, the Lex Salica, which exists in multiple recensions dating from the early 6th century onward and is edited in the Monumenta Germaniae Historica, represents a genuine attempt to create a systematic legal framework for a post-Roman society. It is not Roman law. It is something different. A legal culture that combines Roman and Germanic elements, written in Latin, and oriented toward the specific social conditions of the Frankish world. The legal historian Patrick Wormald, who's the making of English law, King Alfred of the 12th century, published in 1999, is one of the foundational studies of early medieval legal culture, argued throughout his career that the production of written law codes in the early medieval period represents a significant cultural and institutional achievement. The Germanic kings who commissioned law codes were doing something Roman, writing law, committing it to text, claiming the authority to define legal norms in written form, while also doing something non-Roman, because the social conditions they were legislating for and constituencies they were addressing were not Roman in the same sense. The Visigothic Code, compiled in Iberia and reaching its final form in the late 7th century, is a sophisticated legal document that draws heavily on Roman legal tradition while adapting it to Visigothic social conditions. It governed a multi-ethnic society in which Romans and Visigoths lived under a common legal framework, a significant institutional achievement for a period supposedly characterized by the total collapse of legal culture. The emergence of the Carolingian Empire in the late 8th century represents another stage in this institutional development. Charlemagne's capitularies, the administrative decrees issued from his court, represent a serious attempt to create an imperial administrative system capable of governing a large and diverse territory. The attempt was ultimately unsuccessful in its most ambitious aspirations. The empire fragmented after Charlemagne's death, divided among his grandsons by the Treaty of Verdun in 843. But the institutional frameworks it created, the network of counts and bishops and missi dominici, the royal traveling inspectors who carried the emperor's authority into the localities, were real and had lasting effects. The Treaty of Verdun itself is significant. It divided the Carolingian Empire into 3 parts that correspond, very roughly, to the later shapes of France, Germany, and a middle territory that includes what is now the Low Countries, Burgundy, Lorraine, and northern Italy. The correspondence is not precise, and historians rightly resist a nationalist teleology that sees in Verdun the birth of the modern European nation-states. But the point stands. The political structures of the early medieval period were not simply disorder. They were, in various ways and with various degrees of stability and effectiveness, the institutional ancestors of the political geography of modern Europe. The historian Thomas N. Bisson, emeritus professor at Harvard and the author of The Crisis of the 12th Century, Power, Lordship, and the Origins of European Government, has argued that the political history of the early medieval period is best understood not as a failure to achieve Roman-style centralized governance, but as the emergence of genuinely new forms of political organization, forms that were adapted to the social and economic conditions of the post-Roman world, and that, in their fragmentation and local variation, were developing the institutional vocabulary that later European governance would draw on. This is not a comfortable story, because it lacks the narrative clarity of either the darkness narrative or a simple recovery narrative. It is a story of simultaneous development in multiple directions, of institutional innovation alongside institutional failure, of new forms emerging from old ruins without any certainty that they would cohere into something more durable. But that is what the evidence shows. And there is something important in that, something that applies beyond the medieval period to the way all of us think about political change and institutional development. We tend to judge historical political structures by how well they approximate the forms we are familiar with. We look at the Frankish kingdom and see the absence of Roman bureaucracy, the absence of professional civil service, the absence of codified law enforced through independent courts. And we read absence as failure. But the Frankish kingdom was not trying and failing to be Rome. It was trying to be something else, something suited to different conditions, different resources, different populations, and in many of its particulars, it succeeded. And now, having moved through the agricultural fields and the scriptoria and the Islamic libraries and the Carolingian courts, we should pause at a place that the standard account mentions only in passing, and that deserves considerably more attention. We should go to a city, not Rome, not Constantinople, not Baghdad, Cordoba. In the 10th century, Cordoba was the capital of the Umayyad Emirate and then Caliphate of Al-Andalus, the Islamic political entity that had governed most of the Iberian Peninsula since the Arab and Berber conquest of 711 under the Caliph Abd al-Rahman III, who ruled from 912 to 961, and his son Al-Hakam II, who ruled until 976. Cordoba became one of the largest and most sophisticated cities in Europe, possibly the largest city west of Constantinople. Contemporary sources describe a city of elaborate architecture, extensive libraries, sophisticated hydraulic engineering, and a cosmopolitan population that included Muslims, Christians, and Jews living under a common political authority. The scholar Maria Rosa Menacle, in her work The Ornament of the World, How Muslims, Jews, and Christians Created a Culture of Tolerance in Medieval Spain, paint an evocative picture of this convivencia, this coexistence, as one of the most remarkable cultural experiments in medieval history. Menacle's account has been contested by later scholars, including Brian Catlos of the University of Colorado and Simon Barton, who have argued that she romanticized a degree of genuine tolerance and equality in Al-Andalus, and that the condition of non-Muslims under Islamic rule, while not as uniformly oppressive as a simple demi-subjugation narrative would suggest, was not the harmonious cultural synthesis she described. This is a legitimate scholarly correction, and the honest account must include it. But the cultural production of Al-Andalus is not in dispute. The philosophical work of Ibn Rushd, Averroes, as he was known in the Latin West, produced in Cordoba in the 12th century, was among the most important Aristotelian commentary in the medieval world. His detailed commentaries on almost the entire Aristotelian corpus were translated into Latin by Michael Scott in the early 13th century and became the primary channel through which Aristotelian philosophy entered the European university curriculum. When Dante placed Averroes in limbo in the first canto of the Inferno, placing him among the virtuous pagans as one of the great philosophical minds of human history, he was acknowledging a debt that the entire Latin intellectual tradition owed to Islamic Iberia. The physician Ibn Zur, Avenzoar in the Latin tradition, practicing in Seville in the 12th century, contributed original observations on the causes and treatment of several diseases that went beyond his classical and Arabic sources. The mathematician Al-Zarqali, working in Toledo in the 11th century, produced astronomical tables of a precision that made him the most accurate observer of planetary motion in the world at that time. His Toledo tables were translated into Latin and became the basis of astronomical calculation in European universities for nearly a century. This is not the periphery of the story of human intellectual progress in the early medieval period. It is the center. And it was happening on the European continent, in a period that the standard account characterizes as dark, because the standard account was written by people who defined Europe in ways that excluded the Islamic civilization that had been present in Iberia for 5 centuries. The label Dark Ages, it turns out, was not just chronologically wrong. It was geographically wrong. It was wrong about what counted as European. It was wrong about who the legitimate heirs of classical antiquity were. And it was wrong, most fundamentally, about what civilization requires and where you look to find it. Not in the literary output of the Roman tradition alone. Not in the Latin language alone. Not in the political forms of the empire alone. but in the persistence of human beings doing the next thing, in the monk copying Galen, in the mathematician in Baghdad finding a new way to work with unknowns, in the farmer in Carolingian Francia fitting a new kind of collar to a horse, in the mosaic artist in Ravenna setting each tessera at the angle that will catch the most light, in the quiet, unglamorous, extraordinary continuity of human work. That is what those centuries were full of, and that, as much as anything, is what the old story got wrong. There is a particular kind of grief that historians rarely talk about, not the grief of loss. That one is familiar, and the history of the early medieval period contains enough of it to fill many evenings. The grief of lost cities, lost texts, lost populations, lost skills. That grief is real and it deserves to be acknowledged, and we have tried throughout this evening to hold it honestly alongside everything else. No, the grief, is different. It is the grief of misrecognition. The grief of something that was real and active and alive and doing its work in the world, and that was looked at by later eyes and pronounced absent, pronounced dark, pronounced as though it were not there. I find this, personally, one of the most affecting dimensions of this entire story. Not the collapse, not the violence, not even the genuine losses, but the moment, repeated across centuries of historiography, embedded in textbooks and lecture halls and popular culture, when the living thing was looked at and declared dead. Because misrecognition has consequences. When you declare something absent, you stop looking for it. When you stop looking for it, you stop finding it. And when you stop finding it, the declaration of absence seemed confirmed. It becomes self-reinforcing. The empty category fills with nothing, because you decided in advance that nothing is what it contains. This is not unique to the Dark Ages. Every culture does this. Every age does this to the age before it. Think about what it means to name a period, not to describe it, not analyze it. To name it, the act of naming a historical era, is an act of power. It decides what the period is for. It decides what questions are worth asking about it. It decides which features of the period are foreground and which recede into the background. It decides, most fundamentally, whether the period is understood on its own terms or on the terms of whoever is doing the naming. Petrarch named the Dark Ages for himself. He was a man of the 14th century looking backward, and what he saw when he looked was the distance between the civilization he revered, the Rome of Cicero and Virgil, and the civilization he inhabited. And that distance was real. He was not inventing it. The Latin of the 14th century was not the Latin of Cicero. The political world of medieval Italy was not the political world of the Republic. The cultural and aesthetic values of the Italian cities of his time were, in many respects, organized around different priorities than the classical culture he loved. But here's the thing about looking backward from a specific vantage point. What you see is always partially a function of where you're standing. Petrarch was standing in the humanist tradition of 14th century Italian city culture, and he was looking for the markers of the classical tradition he had been taught to revere. And because those specific markers, that particular form of Latin prose, that particular constellation of philosophical schools, that particular architecture of public rhetoric, were not continuously present in the intervening centuries in the forms he recognized, he pronounced the intervening centuries dark. He was not lying. He was looking through the only lens he had. But the lens was not neutral. No lens ever is. The scholarly consensus, based on the history of historiography, on the study of how historical interpretation itself changes over time, tells us that the darkness label was shaped by a specific set of ideological requirements that were most intense in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. The Renaissance humanists needed a before to thereafter. The Protestant reformers needed a period of Catholic darkness to contrast with their own recovered light of Scripture. The Enlightenment philosophes needed a barbarous, superstitious medieval past to throw their own rational modernity into relief. Each of these intellectual traditions had genuine intellectual achievements to its name. The Renaissance did produce extraordinary art and architecture. The Reformers did raise genuinely important questions about ecclesiastical authority. The Enlightenment did produce political philosophy of lasting importance. But the story they told about the medieval period was, in each case, organized primarily around their own self-presentation rather than around careful attention to the evidence of what those centuries actually contained. The interesting claim, and this is one that is less certain but more evocative, is that this pattern is not a medieval problem. It is a human problem. A permanent feature of how minds and civilizations construct their own identities through the past. We all do this. Every nation does this. Every political movement does this. Every intellectual tradition does this. We tell stories about the past that validate our present, that make our particular moment feel like the culmination of a long process, that make the struggles and achievement of earlier ages legible as preparation for what we believe we are now doing. The Renaissance told a story of recovery from darkness. The Enlightenment told a story of reason overcoming superstition. The various nationalist movements of the 19th century told stories of ancient folk souls finding their political expression in the modern nation-state. The progressive movements of the 20th century told stories of oppression giving way to liberation. The conservative movements of the 20th century told stories of traditional wisdom threatened by radical disruption. None of these stories are pure fabrications. They all contain elements of real history, real patterns, real evidence. But they are all, to varying degrees, organized around the present needs of the people telling them rather than around the past reality of the periods they describe. This is not a cynical observation. It is not a claim that all historical interpretations are equally valid, or that the evidence doesn't matter, or that we can never get closer to what actually happened. The work of scholars like Wickham and McCormick and McKitterick and Ward Perkins and Hamerow, the patient excavation of sites and manuscripts and coin hoards and pollen records, all of this represents a genuine effort to know what actually happened, as opposed to what we might prefer to happen, and produces genuine, revisable, improvable knowledge. But it is a reminder that every lens is a frame, and that the frame is always doing work. What moves me most about this history, and I say this in my own voice, as someone who has spent a great deal of time living in these centuries, in particular way that reading and thinking about them allows, is not the grand political changes, not the rise and fall of empires, not the great military campaigns, not even intellectual achievements, extraordinary as they are. What moves me most is the quieter human persistence underneath all of it. The monk in the cold scriptorium, not because anyone was watching, not because posterity was guaranteed, not because he could have known that what he was copying would survive. Sometimes it didn't. Sometimes the monastery burned and the manuscript with it. And the only reason we know some texts existed at all is that they were cited by other texts that survived, but because he had been taught that it mattered, and he believed it. The farmer in Carolingian Francia, fitting a new collar to a horse because the old one made the animal choke, because he had noticed over years of work that there was a better way, because the improvement was worth the effort even if no one would ever know his name. The mathematician in Baghdad working through a problem about unknown quantities, not because anyone had commanded him to, not because the answer was obviously useful, but because the problem was there and his mind was the kind of mind that could not leave a problem alone. These are not extraordinary people in the sense of being exceptional or unusual. They are ordinary people doing what ordinary people do. The next thing, the thing that comes after the previous thing, the work that is available to them in the conditions they actually inhabit, with the tools they actually have, and the fact that their work was systematically dismissed not by their contemporaries, who had a rather different view of what they were doing, but by later centuries that needed them to have been in darkness, seems to me one of the more poignant forms of injustice that history can produce. Not violent injustice, not the injustice of oppression or exploitation, though the early medieval period contained plenty of both. The injustice of being invisible, of doing real work that is subsequently declared not to have happened. There's a modern parallel here that I want to name carefully, because I do not want to collapse the distance between the medieval past and the present. That distance is real, and it should be respected. People in the 6th century were not us. They thought differently, organized their experience differently, related to time and authority and the divine and the natural world in ways that are genuinely foreign to most contemporary sensibilities. But the pattern of the powerful telling stories about the less powerful that serve the powerful's purposes, that pattern is not medieval. It is permanent. Every century has its version of the darkness narrative. A group of people, a culture, a period, a tradition that is declared to have been empty or inferior or uncivilized, and that declaration is used to justify something, a conquest, a neglect, a hierarchy, an assumption of inheritance. The missionaries who went to Ireland and Africa and the Americas told themselves they were bringing light to darkness. The colonial administrators who dismantled existing legal and political institutions told themselves there had been nothing there worth preserving. The educational systems that focus entirely on the classical and Renaissance traditions told their students, implicitly or explicitly, that everything worth knowing had been produced by a specific set of people in a specific set of places, and that the rest was silence. These were not simply mistakes. They were choices. Choices about what to look at, what to count, what to take seriously, and what to declare absent. The history of the Dark Ages is, among other things, a history of those choices and their consequences, and the correction of the Dark Ages narrative. The patient, decades-long work of archaeologists and manuscript scholars and agricultural historians and economic historians, the work of going back to the actual evidence with better tools and fewer presuppositions, is a reminder that those choices can be revisited, that the declaration of absence is not final, that what was looked past can be looked at again. The philosopher Hans Georg Gadamer, in his great work Truth and Method, published in German in 1960 and translated into English in 1975, made an argument about historical understanding that I have found myself returning to throughout the years I have spent thinking about these questions. Gadamer argued that all understanding is historically situated, that we always come to the past from a specific present, with specific preconceptions, and that those preconceptions are not simply obstacles to be cleared away before we can see the past as it really was. They are the condition of possibility of any understanding at all. We cannot see the past from nowhere. We can only see it from somewhere. But, and this is the crucial turn in his argument, the recognition of our own historical situatedness is itself a form of understanding. When we become aware of the lens we are using, when we begin to see the frame around our view, we gain something. Not objectivity, because objectivity in the absolute sense is not available to historically situated beings, but something better, perhaps, than objectivity, the capacity for genuine dialogue with the past, the capacity to let the past challenge our preconceptions rather than simply confirming them. The revision of the Dark Ages narrative is, in this sense, an example of what genuine historical understanding looks like in practice. It is a tradition becoming aware of its own lens. It is scholarship doing the difficult work of distinguishing between what the evidence shows and what previous generations of scholars needed the evidence to show. It is not finished. It will not be finished, because the next generation of scholars will bring their own preconceptions to the same material, and those preconceptions will illuminate some things and obscure others, and the generation after that will have to do the same work again with new tools and new questions. This is not a reason for despair. It is simply a description of what historical knowledge is, an ongoing conversation between present and past, never fully settled, always revisable, always moving toward a greater completeness that it never quite reaches. There is something else I want to say about the specific period we have been inhabiting tonight, something that goes beyond the historiographical argument and touches on what this era might mean for the way we think about our own time. We are living in the early 21st century in a period of significant disruption. The economic and institutional structures that the post-war decades built, the structures of liberal democratic governance, of global trade, of multilateral institutions, of a certain arrangement of power and knowledge and communication, are under pressures that are visible and real. Technologies are changing faster than institutions can adapt. Political authority is fragmenting. The cultural consensus about what constitutes a good life in a just society is fracturing in ways that seem sometimes almost geological in their scale. In the language of the darkness narrative, one might be tempted to say, we are living through a fall, but the early medieval period suggests a different way of framing this. Not fall, a transformation. The people of the 5th and 6th centuries were not living through a pause in history. They were not waiting for the Renaissance to rescue them. They were doing the work that was available to them in the conditions they actually inhabited. And some of that work, the monastery, the heavy plow, the translation movement, the new forms of law, turned out to be the foundation things whose full dimensions would only become visible centuries later. We cannot know, from inside our own transformation, what the foundation we are laying will eventually support. We cannot see, from where we stand, what the historians of the 25th century will make of the things we are building and losing and forgetting and discovering right now. But the medieval evidence suggests that the things worth doing are worth doing anyway, not because posterity is guaranteed, not because the institutions will hold, not because the manuscripts won't burn, but because doing the next thing, the careful, specific, unglamorous, ordinary work of copying and plowing and calculating and building, is what persistence looks like from the inside. And persistence, it turns out, is what history is mostly made of. There is a question I have never seen fully answered in the scholarship, and I want to sit with it here for a moment, without pretending to resolve it. Why did the darkness narrative stick for so long? Not why was it invented. We have traced that story through Petrarch and the humanists and Enlightenment, and it is reasonably clear. But why did it persist decade after decade in educational systems that had, in principle, access to the counter-evidence? Why did generations of students learn about the fall of Rome as the beginning of a long darkness, when the manuscripts that contradicted that picture were sitting in the same libraries as the textbooks that promoted it? Part of the answer is institutional inertia. Textbooks reproduce textbooks. Curricula reproduce curricula. The categories of one generation become the assumptions of the next, not through deliberate choice, but through the simple mechanics of transmission. Part of the answer is disciplinary fragmentation. The archaeologist and the manuscript scholar and the agricultural historian and the economic historian were each, in their own domains, accumulating evidence that complicated the simple picture. But they were not always talking to each other. The synthesis, the kind of synthesis that Wickham achieved in framing the early Middle Ages, required both an individual of unusual breadth and a moment in scholarship when the accumulated evidence in multiple disciplines had reached a critical mass. But there's a third part of the answer that I find most interesting and most uncomfortable. The darkness narrative was useful. It was useful not just to the people who invented it, but to the structures of education and cultural self-understanding that inherited it. It provided a before and an after for the story of Western civilization, a story that a particular tradition needed to tell about itself. And that story served purposes that went well beyond historical accuracy. It organized cultural prestige. It justified hierarchies of knowledge. It defined who counted as the inheritors of civilization and who did not. Giving up the darkness narrative required giving up something beyond an erroneous historical claim. It required giving up a story about who we are. And that is always harder. That is always the last thing to change. The scholarly consensus, based on the accumulated evidence of the past several decades, tells us that the early medieval period was a time of genuine transformation, genuine innovation, and genuine continuity, alongside genuine loss and genuine disruption. But there's another reading, one that is less certain but more evocative, which is that the real significance of the Dark Ages story is not about the past at all. It is about the present. It is about what happens when a civilization tells itself a story about its own origins that is organized primarily around its own prestige, about what it misses and what it dismisses, and who it renders invisible in the process. And it is about what happens when someone, somewhere, goes back to look at the actual evidence with fresh eyes. Turns out there was a watermill in that valley. Turns out there was gold in that field. Turns out there was a man in a room with a lamp copying something that no one else was going to copy. Turns out the darkness was not where they said it was. Or rather, the darkness was real in places, but it was not the whole story. It was never the whole story. The whole story is always larger than the name we give it. And the work of history, patient, specific, unglamorous, ongoing, is the work of trying to see the whole story more clearly. Not perfectly, not finally, just more clearly. That is what this evening has been doing. And it is, I think, what the monk in the scriptorium was doing too, in his own different way. Try and hold more of the story than would otherwise survive. Let that thought settle. Let the work of history and the work of the monk converge in the quiet of wherever you are. Let the lamp go low. The story is almost complete. We are going back, now, to where we began,